Welcome everyone to Learning Unit 4. Today we're going to cover one of the most foundational topics in international communication, the international flow of news. Who produces it, who controls it, who receives it, and who is largely invisible. This unit is essential preparation for assignment 2, particularly question 1.2, where you'll need to apply two theories from this unit to the K-pop scenario and evaluate how the Korean wave confirms, challenges, or complicates each theory. We'll move through theories, the role of global news agencies, what typically makes it into international news, and what doesn't, and then zoom into Africa and South Africa specifically. So this slide gives you the map of the unit. Let's walk through it briefly so you know what's coming and why each section matters. Section 4.2 is the theoretical heart. We cover three theories: structural imperialism and world systems theory, dependency theory and media imperialism, and media framing theory. These are the theories you'll apply in your assignment. Section 4.3 explores the filters that determine why some news travels internationally and some doesn't, broken into context factors and event factors. Section 4.4 looks at the actual machinery of global news, the big three agencies, AFP, AP, and Reuters, and how they dominate the global information order. Section 4.5 and 4.6 examine the consequences, what kinds of stories get told, what biases they carry, and how the internet and social media are changing, not fully correcting these patterns. Section 4.8 and 4.9 bring it home to Africa and South Africa, where we sit in all of this and what that means for both journalism and our specific K-pop scenario. So before we start, where do you think most of the world's international news comes from? Think about that for a moment. And then, who decides what gets covered? Activate that prior thinking of yours. Now we get to our three key theories. The first and most foundational theory we need to understand is Galton's structural theory of imperialism, extended by Kim and Barnett into the world systems framework. The central claim is simple but powerful. The world is not flat. Countries occupy different structural positions in a global hierarchy: center, semi-periphery, and periphery. And this position determines how much of the world's news they produce, how much about them gets reported, and where information flows. So the center countries are the USA, UK, France, Germany. They are major news producers and major news exporters. They generate most of the world's daily news content and set the global news agenda. Then we get to the semi-peripheral countries, such as South Korea, Brazil, India, and South Africa, that occupy a middle position. They produce some news, have some regional influence, but still depend heavily on the center for international coverage. And then we have the peripheral countries, which is most of sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and they are largely passive receivers of news. Little news flows from them, but most news flows to them. So what are the key implications? And this is according to Mulwana. News flows vertically from the center to the periphery. The dominant pattern, and that's the dominant pattern globally. There is little or no exchange of news directly between peripheral countries. They read about each other through the center's media. More news is exchanged between center and semi-periphery than between center and periphery. Physical and cultural proximity is a major criterion in media selection of international reports. So how do we then apply this to K-pop and the assignment, particular to question 1.2? South Korea is a semi-peripheral country, and the Korean wave is therefore a test case for this theory. The theory predicts that South Korean cultural products would struggle to gain global traction without the endorsement or distribution infrastructure of center countries. The fact that K-pop did break through raises fascinating questions. So we can say in this case, We can firstly confirm, yes, K-pop still depends on center country-owned platforms like YouTube, Spotify, Netflix, TikTok. Therefore, the circular flow persists. Korean events are still first covered by Western press, then redistributed globally. We can challenge this idea by saying that the band BTS achieved 4.02 million first-week album sales without Western major label backing. And this was for a previous album of theirs. Just this past week, they had 4 million single day sales without Western major label backing. The very popular Netflix series Squid Game came #1 in 94 countries. BTS addressed the UN General Assembly on behalf of the South Korean government. So there we see a challenge of this theory. But then, and I think this is very important, we can also complicate the theory, saying South Korea's success is not necessarily spontaneous. Yes, it required deliberate state cultural industry investment after the 1997 financial crisis. And this we see in the prescribed reading of Kwon and Kim. And this is a strategically enabled counterflow, not organic periphery resistance. Strabhar, is also another prescribed reading, that concept of asymmetrical interdependence offers more precision in this particular case. So I want to stress the word complicates. You need to be nuanced in your discussion when it comes to question 1.2. Simply saying that K-pop disproves the world systems theory will not necessarily get you full marks for that particular question. Now we look at the 3 directions of news flow, and that was a concept developed by Moana as well. And all 3 directions you will see privilege the north. Pattern A, center to periphery, is seen as vertical flow. The bulk of the international news originates from the global north and flows to the global south. This is empirically well documented. Research from Latin America, Arab countries, and Africa all confirm that local media is dominated still to this day by northern content. Then we have our pattern B, north to south. This is directional flow. Even when a southern event is covered, it travels through a circular path. It's gathered by northern journalists, processed by northern agencies, and then redistributed back to the south. The periphery loses control of its own narrative in this case. And then we have pattern C, which is a triangular flow. East and West each cover their own regions first. Third world press, or developing world press, is disproportionately dependent on coverage from both the Eastern and Western blocs. Western Europe and North America are the most visible areas globally. The proximity principle runs through all 3 patterns. Geographic, cultural, political, and ideological closeness shapes what gets covered. This helps explain why countries with shared histories, like the UK and its former colonies, have stronger news ties than geographically closer but historically unrelated countries. So let's think again. When you read international news in South African media, where does most of it come from? And this is whether you still read it in a very traditional way, in a newspaper, whether you read it online. Where does that news originate from? And not the particular story, like like not something that happened, but that story that was written about it. Where did that come from? Did it maybe come from AFP? That means it came from the North. So if you think about this question, this should connect the abstract theory that we just discussed to your lived experience. The second theoretical cluster that you need to know for your assignment is the dependency theory, and it's expressed most sharply in the concept of media imperialism. So the dependency theory divides the world into a center of Western developed countries and a periphery. Poverty and underdevelopment on the periphery are not accidents. They are the product of historical colonization and ongoing exploitation by developed capitalist institutions. This dependency extends to information, and this means that peripheral countries depend on the center not just for manufactured goods, but for news, media content, and communication infrastructure. So let's look at media imperialism. This Boyd and Barrett defines media imperialism as a process through which the ownership, structure, dissemination, and content of media in any country are subjected to considerable external pressure from dominant country media interests without proportional reverse influence. In other words, it's a one-way imposition, not an exchange. Boyd Barrett identifies four variations of how media influence spreads: through deliberate commercial strategy, unconscious diffusion of values, deliberate political acceptance, and unconscious absorption through contact. Then we get to cultural imperialism, and this extends to culture more broadly. The homogenizing influence of Western American consumer culture, which then threatens local cultures. Critics correctly note that this is overly deterministic and ignores audience agency. Then reversed cultural imperialism, as proposed by Tomlinson. Counterexamples shows the US doesn't always dominate. And we discussed this previously in study unit 3 as well. Bollywood, Nollywood, and crucially for us for this particular assignment, K-pop. These represent flows of culture from semi-peripheral and peripheral countries that complicate the simple imperialism narrative. So let's look again. The application to K-pop confirms K-pop's production values and market strategies are modeled on Western industry templates. Streaming infrastructure remains Silicon Valley, so the US, it's owned by Silicon Valley. The dependency persists at the platform level, even when the content is Korean. Let's look at how it challenges this theory. A non-Western cultural product achieves genuine global dominance. Western artists have now started incorporating K-pop aesthetic and collaboration. Think about the immense popularity of K-pop Demon Hunters, for example. We have a reversal of the traditional direction of cultural influence. But here, once again, we come to how does K-pop and Korean New Wave complicate the theory? We can say that this is not just simple cultural resistance, it's cultural hybridity. Straubaug's concept of asymmetrical interdependence is more precise. Countries are interdependent, but unequally so, with varying capacity to produce, distribute, and export cultural content. So Straubhaar is on your prescribed reading list. If you are using it as one of the 3 readings, make sure that you understand this concept of cultural proximity and how it explains why Korean content resonates differently in different markets. The third theory is media framing, introduced by Goffman and developed in the international communication context by scholars like Zhao. The core idea is that news is never a transparent window into reality. Journalists make choices, what to highlight, what to leave out, what angle to take, whose voices to quote, and these choices constitute a frame, a way of organizing meaning that makes some interpretations seem natural and others invisible. For international communication, framing is especially important because audiences in one country rely almost entirely on framed accounts of events in other countries. If all the frames come from the same cultural and institutional sources, the result is a very partial picture of the world. So a case study then mentioned is the Ethiopian elections of 2005, and it illustrates framing in action. 2 agencies covered the same elections with radically different frames. Reuters, which is a global Western agency, focused on violence, arrests, crackdowns, failure of democracy. The election was framed as yet another failed African democratic process. The Ethiopian news agency, which is state-owned, framed the process as democratic, legitimate, and constitutional. The government leaders were seen as visionary. The opposition was seen as unconstitutional. But both these frames were skewed. Reuters by its institutional pessimism about Africa, and the ENA by its obligation to the ruling government. Neither provided a full, balanced account. The key lesson here is, when global agencies dominate international news flows, their particular frames, often shaped by Western assumptions about the developing world, become the dominant frame globally. This is framing as a form of soft power. So how do we connect this to the K-pop scenario? Let's think. How did Western media initially frame Korean cultural content? And how has that framing now shifted as K-pop became commercially significant? Thinking about this makes framing theory directly applicable to question 1.2 in your assignment. But it's not all about theories. We also need to understand the practical factors that determine which events make it into international news and which don't. Chang identifies two categories of filters. Firstly, we have the extra media or the context factors, and these are the factors external to the news event itself. Specific structural conditions that determine whether a country's events are likely to be covered at all. So let's look at these factors. Firstly, the world system position. Events on the periphery or semi-periphery need an extra hook, something to grab the attention, to get that center country attention. Economic variables. Countries with a high GDP, significant trade relationships, or oil production get more coverage. Political and ideological environment, press freedom, censorship, and political alignment all shape news flow. Then we have social and cultural proximity, shared language, religion, migration history between countries. Geographic proximity, though it's less important at very great distances. And then we have population size and literacy. Larger, more literate populations produce and consume more news. Our second category is event-related or content factors. These are characteristics of the event itself that make it more newsworthy internationally. And these include social deviancy, events that destabilize the status quo, coups, uprisings, regime change. This will also, I would say, include, for example, something like the Epstein files, although that also links to the normative deviancy, which we'll move to now. But let's first look at statistical deviancy. The sheer scale of an event, for example, a natural disaster or a mass casualty, the earthquake in Haiti, something huge like that. Then normative deviancy, events that violate fundamental social norms. Anything related to cults, for example. I mentioned the Epstein files. It goes against social norms. Relevance to elite nations or individuals, events involving the USA, British royals, major celebrities. Timeliness, news from the periphery that reaches agencies late, often will get ignored. And then human interest, emotionally resonant stories that cross cultural barriers. The example there, very old, but the Chilean miners. I don't know who of you would still remember that particular event. So what is the key research finding here? Chang uses the WTO case study. At the World Trade Organization Congress in Singapore, every country was given equal speaking time. Yet, Reuters news releases mentioned the USA in 87% of stories on day one, Japan in 43%, Japan not speaking on day one, while most peripheral countries who did speak were completely ignored. African countries made up 23% of speakers but appeared in only 9% of news reports. The conclusion? A country's newsworthiness is almost entirely determined by its position in the world system and not by its actual activity or speech. This case study is actually an excellent empirical evidence for your assignment, and you can use it to support your application of the world systems theory to K-pop. South Korea had to build alternative distribution channels precisely because traditional news metrics would have kept it invisible. So before we examine what international news contains, we need to understand who controls its production. The answer since the 1990s is essentially three organizations. And this might have changed slightly since the production of the study guide, but it will generally still be very similar numbers. So we have the AFP, which is the Agence France Presse. Founded in 1835, it's French, distributes 5,000 text stories per day in 6 languages 20 television reports, up to 3,000 photographs, and it has 5 regional headquarters globally. Then we have the Associated Press, founded in 1846 in the USA. It's a not-for-profit cooperative owned by US newspaper and broadcast members. It employs thousands of people across more than 300 locations. It's won several Pulitzer Prizes and is considered the backbone of the world's information system. And then from the UK, we have Reuters, which was founded in 1851. It has an extensive private satellite network. It reaches probably much more than 50 million users per month now, and began as a stock market quotation service, and now it's the world's largest financial news provider. All 3 of these agencies are concentrated in North America and Western Europe. All 3 have retained close identification with specific nation states. The AFP obviously with France, AP with the USA, and Reuters with Britain. And this matters enormously. These agencies do not merely report the world neutrally. They report it from a particular structural location with particular editorial traditions. Meyer found that between 56 and 76% of international news content in African newspapers came from these global agencies, and this was back in the 1980s. In Asian countries, the figure for TV news was between 80 and 100%. So let's look at hierarchy, dependency, and imperialism in practice. Boyd Barrett describes these agencies as wholesalers. They gather news globally and sell it to national agencies, the retailers, who then distribute it locally. The national agencies have little choice but to buy from the wholesalers, creating a structural dependency that has persisted since the 19th century news cartel. So let's think again. Do you think it matters that YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok are all owned by US or Chinese corporations? How does this connect to the wholesaler-retailer model that I've just mentioned if we think about the K-pop digital ecosystem? You will see that thinking about these questions will bridge Learning Unit 4 to Learning Unit 6, which focuses on, and particularly the section that focuses on the political economy. So now we ask ourselves, what does international news actually look like? Research by Mulwana, Patterson, and Van Ginneken identifies several consistent patterns that represent the accumulated impact of all the structural factors we've discussed. Firstly, Western dominance. USA and Western Europe are consistently and regularly covered in media globally. Third world or developing countries only enter coverage when caught in a crisis involving a center country. Stereotyping. Developing world coverage concentrates on disasters, conflict, and corruption. Progress, development, and cultural achievement are largely invisible. This creates a sustained impression of chaos, backwardness, and irrationality. Then we have the element of elite focus. News coverage gravitates toward so-called elite nations and so-called elite people. The USA, British royals, major corporations. These generate disproportionate news volume relative to their actual significance. Then we look at events being, or news being event-driven and not process-driven. We see so-called parachute journalists arriving at a crisis, covering it briefly and moving on. Context, history, and underlying processes are largely absent and not covered. Norris links this to the rise of television news formats. We then look at circular flow. Even news about peripheral countries is gathered by northern journalists, processed at northern agencies, and only then distributed back to those countries. This means Africa reads about itself very often through northern eyes. And then we see how it reproduces the status quo. The aggregate effect of all of this is to reinforce the existing hierarchy. Center countries remain the newsmakers. Peripheral countries remain the news objects. So what is our general conclusion here? The current state of the flow and content of news does not provide an accurate, complete, or comprehensive picture of objective realities in every corner of the world. This is a strong scholarly consensus, not just a political opinion. And we can also connect this to framing theory. These aren't random biases, but structural outcomes of who owns the agencies, where they are located, and what editorial traditions they carry. If we think in terms of your assignment, where you are dealing with K-pop, and the Korean wave. Think about the success of, for example, Squid Game and its global success and how it happened despite these 6 patterns and not because of them. So for decades, scholars have asked, will the internet fix things? Will digital technology level the playing field and allow peripheral countries to tell their stories? The honest answer is partially, but not fundamentally. What the internet has changed, the promise, is low-cost distribution. Rampal called the internet the best hope to developing countries seeking a low-cost vehicle for news distribution. Emerging agencies can now reach global subscribers affordably. The promise is bypassing gatekeepers. Citizens can now bypass traditional gatekeepers. If we think of something like citizen journalism and amateur foreign correspondence. Hamilton and Jenner coined the term amateur foreign correspondent for ordinary people who break news internationally. And what is used for this? Something like the formerly known Twitter or X. So 3,440 tweets were sent per second when Osama bin Laden's death was confirmed in 2011. Then we can look at this, and that links to speed and spread. If a local in the city of Abbottabad live tweeted the raid without even knowing what was happening. So it was instantaneous, that information. It spread across the globe. So social media can then oftentimes tell of events before official news media can actually report on them. But we also have the limits. What the internet has not changed. The digital divide. Access remains profoundly unequal. By June 2010, only 10.8% of South Africa's population had internet access. And we addressed this in a previous study unit. Yes, that number has increased substantially in 16 years. But we still see a very distinct digital divide. The cost and infrastructure remain very important barriers across the developing world. There is a sense of unverifiability. Social media cannot necessarily verify content. In 2010, a Twitter rumor that Nelson Mandela had died spread so rapidly that reputable foreign news outlets actually reported it as fact. What is important is that the internet is not borderless. China's Great Firewall, Saudi Arabia's filtering systems all show that the internet is shaped by political power, just like traditional media. It is very unlikely that social media will replace formal journalism. Users are informed of events through social media, but they return to the established sources for verified, contextualized reporting. And it's this tension, the democratizing promise of the internet versus the structural limits, that is directly relevant to question 1.3 and question 1.5 in your assignment. You should connect the digital divide here to your discussion of South African access to the K-pop digital ecosystem. So that's just to repeat again, and for you to have on screen and to look at it. The democratizing promise of the internet, all the good things that the internet is supposed to bring, versus the structural limits. This is relevant to question 1.3 and question 1.5. And we want to see that you can connect the concept of the digital divide to your discussion of South African access to the K-pop digital ecosystem. So let's bring everything together and situate Africa and South Africa specifically within everything we've discussed. First, we look at Africa as periphery. MacPhail places most of Africa firmly on the periphery of the world news system. News flows to Africa from Western agencies. The content that Africa receives about itself reflects very often Western biases described in section 4.5, crisis, disaster, and conflict. Erribo adds that African countries not only receive distorted images of the world, they also receive distorted images of themselves. And that is extremely problematic. You will see how this also bridges once again between learning unit 4 and learning unit 6. After covering Africa's peripheral position, it naturally transitions to how we are going to explore in Learning Unit 6, the Digital Divide in Depth, and we will be using the ICT Development Index, and that once again then connects directly to question 1.5 of your assignment. South Africa as semi-periphery, South Africa occupies a special position, a regional media hub that produces and exports some news, but remains very much structurally dependent on global agencies. Post-1994, South African media became among the most concentrated in the world. It's regulated by several important acts. Then we have, very importantly here, Channel Africa, which was one of the few African attempts to produce and distribute news from Africa to Africa. We don't have necessarily that anymore, but we've got several other stations and networks. If you think of Newsroom Africa, for example, we have, and so think, for example, how is if South Africa's media expansion into Africa not necessarily then also a form of media imperialism, this time only in African hands? It's something to think about. The K-pop scenario connects directly to this. Squid Game trended for weeks in South Africa. Army chapters hosted events in Joburg and Cape Town, yet 36% of South Africans live below the upper bound poverty line, and meaningful internet access remains out of reach for many. So the same structural inequalities that shape news flows also shape who can participate in K-pop digital culture. So let's be very specific about what question 1.2 requires and how to approach it for full marks. The question asks you to discuss two theories from Learning Unit 4 that explain the direction and content of international flows of news and information. Apply them to K-pop and critically evaluate the extent to which the Korean wave confirms, challenges, or complicates each theory. So here is then the three-part evaluative move, which will be essential for full marks. Every strong answer in question 1.2 will need the structure for each theory. You will have to say how it confirms, how it challenges, and how it complicates. If you simply argue that K-pop disproves a theory without nuance, you won't receive more than 6.8 for this question. You need to follow the confirm, challenge, complicate structure. And you can work through the various theories to then see how this works. What is very important here, and that I want to remind you about, is the scenario that we provide you at the beginning of the assignment is not background reading. It is evidence. Every theoretical claim should be illustrated with a specific detail or statistic from the provided scenario. And here we have just a slide that you can use as a revision reference. When you encounter these names in your reading and in the assignment, you need to know what each is known for. So Galtung, structural theory. Boyd Barrett, media imperialism. Kim and Barnett, world systems model. Applied to news flow. Mowana, the three hypotheses on flow direction and the four key conclusions on global news patterns. Patterson, global agencies setting the international news agenda. Tomlinson, reversed cultural imperialism. Strabhar, asymmetrical interdependence and cultural proximity. And this is from a prescribed reading, which is highly relevant to question 1.2. Goffman and Zhao, media framing theory. Demisi, the Ethiopia framing case study. These scholars form the core vocabulary of Learning Unit 4. So in your assignment, each theoretical claim you make should be attributed to at least one of these scholars with the relevant in-text reference. That then brings me to the end of this lesson, where we have looked at study unit or Learning Unit 4 in depth, and particularly in how it relates to your assignment 2. We will have a similar lesson that deals with Learning Unit 6 uploaded on MyUNISA as well.